Jeff Shaara will present History Through Storytelling. Jeff Shaara is the author of 11 New York Times best-selling books on major events in history, from the American Revolution to the Mexican War and Civil War, to the theater of Europe and World Wars I and II. Following the success of the film Gettysburg, based on his father Michael Shaara's series classic Killer Angels, he took up pen and has been writing series ever since. His current deals with the Civil War in the West. The first of 4 books, A Blaze of Glory, covers the Battle of Shiloh and debuted as number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list in May 2012. The second volume, A Chain of Thunder, focuses on the campaign and siege of Vicksburg and was released in May. The next 2 works will feature Chattanooga and the final campaigns of Sherman from Atlanta through the end of the war in the Carolinas, and they will be released a year apart in 2014 and 2015. Please give a warm Sacred Trust welcome for Mr. Jeff Shaara.
Thank you. If you've been here all day listening to people, I admire your stamina. I'll try not to wear you out too much. First of all, I want you to notice right away, I don't have a prepared text. I didn't bring notes to read from. Maybe you've been listening to a lot of that today, and that's fine. That's what historians do. It's not what I do. I'd rather just chat, and the advantage of that is I might chat about just about anything, which is also the disadvantage of that. But I really, before I start talking about anything I'm doing or that I've done, I can never talk to any audience without first mentioning, and of course this audience particularly may be a little more appropriate than some, mentioning that some of you, I know, some of you are here in the first place, or maybe you brought your families here, or maybe your family brought you here years ago because of a book called The Killer Angels. And every time I say that, I see people nod their heads. And if you don't know what the Killer Angels is, in this group, that makes you an anomaly. But I'm happy to tell you. What the Killer Angels is, written by my father in 1974, what the Killer Angels is the story of the Battle of Gettysburg. What it is not is the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. What my father did is he brought you here, he put you into the heads of key people whose decisions, whose actions even determined that there would be a Battle of Gettysburg. Names you know: Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, John Buford. Now, that's not the entire roster of everyone here who did anything important. Of course not. That wasn't my father's intention, to tell you the whole story. That would take, thousands of pages. Someone told me there have been over 900 books written just on the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, if the first guy got it right, why do we need, historians don't like it when I say that. Well, my father didn't care about that. My father just wanted to tell you a good story and find those characters to take you with him back, put you on the battlefield so you are there. You are hearing the story the way they would tell it. That was the magic of the Killer Angels. It worked. Every major college history department, my father was teaching creative writing at Florida State University. There's the history department at Florida State University. Every major university's history department has the Civil War guy. I mean, there's the British guy and the Roman guy and the medieval guy, and there's the Civil War guy. Florida State University had the Civil War guy, and this guy said to my father when The Killer Angels was published, "Who are you to tell us what Robert E. Lee is thinking? The Killer Angels is a book that should never have been written." They were not friends. Sometime after the book was published, a truly wonderful thing happened to my father. A telegram came to his house. Congratulations, The Killer Angels has been awarded the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Now, I don't know if my father took that telegram over to the history department at Florida State, and, you know, they still weren't friends. Now, a writer wins a Pulitzer Prize. That is the pinnacle. He has every right to believe his ship has come in. Anything he wants to write, they'll fight over in New York to publish. You know, his book will become a bestseller. That's what happens to Pulitzer Prize winners. It did not happen to Michael Shaara. Think about 1975, those of you old enough to know, the end of the Vietnam War. Nobody in this country wanted to read a book about generals. It was about as out of fashion a subject as you can imagine. My father was a master of bad timing. Well, that was a crushing disappointment to him, because the book did nothing. It became called what many people describe, a terrible description, a cult book. You know, if you were in the military, if you went to any of the major military academies in this country, it was required reading. It still is. Or if you were a Civil War buff, and there were some in the 70s, you might have heard of the Killer Angels. Otherwise, you never heard of it. He could not find the audience that I have been very fortunate that has found my books, and I take that very seriously. But again, a crushing disappointment to him. He knew what he had created. It seemed like nobody cared. He went on, I'm often asked, what other historical works did he write? People want more. Nothing. He wrote a Hitchcock sci-fi novel after that nobody read, and he wrote a baseball story that was also became a motion picture called For Love of the Game, something he didn't live to see, but nothing historical. One of the rumors that I really don't like to hear, and some of you may know this or think of this, the rumor is that Gods and Generals was in fact written by him, and I slapped my name on it. No, there was no incentive for him to write Gods and Generals. There was no audience for his book in his lifetime. When the movie Gettysburg came out in 1993, the movie, you know, Ted Turner's $22 million Risk, the movie comes out in 1993 based on The Killer Angels. The Killer Angels, on the strength of that, becomes a #1 bestseller 19 years after it was published and 5 years after my father's death. He had no idea that the movie would ever be made or that his book would become a bestseller. That's why I'm standing up here now. Well, the one thing I understood when I started working on this, when Ted Turner, you know, he was excited. Ted gets excited. You know, right now he's excited about buffalo burgers, you know, which is, that's fine. But, you know, Ted wanted to make more movies. That's what I heard. You know, he wanted to take the Killer Angels, go before and after, tell more of the story with some of the same characters. It was always about being a trilogy, and it was always about being a movie. So people ask me, weren't you afraid? You know, how did you know how to write a book? I had no clue. But there was no fear because there were no expectations. The idea is that Ron Maxwell would write a screenplay. I'll put the story together using the same kind of research my father used. My father, this is the one lesson I learned, and anybody who's read any of my books or The Killer Angels knows, it has to be the voices of the characters. Modern biography, modern history, with all due respect to historians, does me no good at all. What my father said, he actually said this to a reporter, a dumb thing to say to a newspaper reporter. During the writing of The Killer Angels, he was visited by every character in the book. Now, when you see that in print, it looks like Michael Shaara is a schizophrenic. I know exactly what he meant. You have to hear the voices, the diaries, the journals, the memoirs, collections of letters. That's where the voices come from. That business of how dare you, who are you to tell us what Robert E. Lee is thinking? Well, if you do the research and you read enough of Robert E. Lee's letters or the memoirs of the people around him, that's how you do that. You feel as though you know the character. Well, the whole idea is I'll put a story together that Ron Maxwell will adapt for a screenplay. It was always about being a movie. And Ron and I actually had the conversation that if whatever I come up with stinks, nobody will ever see it. It'll go in the trash. Representing my father's estate in New York, I'm the businessman in the family. Well, Random House now, of course, has this #1 bestseller. So they take my phone calls. And I'm talking to the publisher in New York, and I'm saying, yeah, well, I'm writing the prequel to The Killer Angels. It's called Gods and Generals, and, Ted Turner wants to make the film, and the publisher said, well, send us the manuscript. We'll take a look. Okay. I sent him the manuscript. The phone call I get back in September of 1995, we don't care if it's a movie. We like the book. We think you're a writer. Here's a contract. That changed my whole life. When I went around the country with Gods and Generals, the publisher sent me on a 59-city book signing tour. Everywhere I go, the Sunday newspaper always has that feature section. Every Sunday newspaper has this. My face is on the cover of these things because, it's a human interest story, the son following in the footsteps of the father. And for you Hemingway buffs, I can't tell you how many times I saw the headline, "The Sun Also Rises." I come here for a week in June, July of 1996. The Gettysburg Times has been very good to me. The front page, larger than this, is my face with the headline, "Son of Killer Angels Returns to Gettysburg." And it was my sister who pointed out to me, you know what that sounds like, don't you? It sounds like the sequel to a slasher movie. It was pretty surreal. Well, and by the way, Gods and Generals debuts on the bestseller list. Now, I'm under no illusions that the great American author has arrived. I know full well I'm getting cut huge slack because people wanted more of the story. They wanted more of the Killer Angels. My father had whet their appetite. I've heard that today. Sitting here signing books, people have told me that it was the Killer Angels that pulled him in, or pulled him here. Pretty impressive. Something he never knew. Well, in going through and of course writing the sequel, The Last Full Measure, and developing these stories and learning and loving these characters, because it really comes down to that. For me to put words in the mouth of anybody, I have to love the character. The only way to do that, again, the voices. And going back to the Mexican War, people have always asked me, the Mexican War, why did you do a story? Who cares about the Mexican War? Every character I researched, most everyone, the names that were here, that were all over the Civil War in various parts, they all talk about their days in Mexico. Young lieutenants right out of West Point, clueless, under the command of this marvelous character, Winfield Scott, the most overlooked military figure in our history. And I started doing the research and realized, that's a book. I need to do this book. And I've had people say to me, oh yeah, Mexican War, that's Teddy Roosevelt going up San Juan Hill. No, whole different thing. 1846 to 1848, most Americans still don't know we had a war with Mexico. I began to hear this wonderful thing from people. I didn't know that. Simple 4 words. And I realized, okay, this is fun. If I can find a story you think you sort of know, you learned a little bit about it in school, but you really don't know the story. And I got very intrigued by that. I began to think of, what's next? What am I going to work on? Going back to the American Revolution, what am I going to tell you you don't know there? Well, you know John Adams and Abigail Adams and George Washington and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and, all of that. And things like, you learn in school, I can tell you the one sentence you learned you had to memorize to pass a test. The American Revolution ends when Charles Cornwallis surrenders to Washington at Yorktown. We all learned that. Wrong. The war goes on for 2 more years in the Carolinas. I had no clue. So great. Nathaniel Greene. I mean, maybe you've heard of Nathaniel Greene, the Stonewall Jackson of the American Revolution. Great stuff. Now I'm into this whole idea of finding stories you don't know. So I go to World War I. You talk about a story people don't know. The great textbooks, the great histories of World War I are written by Brits. John Keegan, Martin Gilbert, I mean, these massive 1,200-page books that nobody wants to read. That's the history of the First World War, and the Americans are mentioned like, chapter 38. It's like, oh, and then the Americans came in the war and it was over. Well, a little more to it than that. Characters like the Red Baron. I was amazed, some of you I know have heard me say this, how many people thought the Red Baron was just a cartoon character. He has a name, Manfred von Richthofen. I mean, this is a man, he shoots down 80 enemy planes, 80, before he meets his own end. And of course, by enemy, I mean, well, he's the German voice in that story, the Lafayette Escadrille. Now, you've heard of that. Blackjack Pershing. I mean, there's a name from your history books. What about the story? That was enormous fun. All the way through that process, when I'm touring for that book, I'm thinking this same way. What can I tell you you don't know? Korea is out there looming large, and I was telling audiences all over the country, I want to do Korea. And I began to think, why is that important? You know what most Americans know about Korea? MASH. With all due respect to MASH people, MASH is not about Korea at all. It's about Vietnam. I mean, it says Korea, and it's set in Korea. It's a Vietnam story. Hawkeye, try talking like that to a general in 1951, and watch what happens to you. No. What about Incheon? What about the Yalu River? What about the Chosin Reservoir? That's Korea. And unless you were there, maybe some of you were, that's a story most people do not know. Very excited about that. And my publisher says, we kind of want to hear your take on World War II. Think about Hollywood. How many Americans get their history from Hollywood? Think about World War II. How many movies have been made about World War II? Hundreds. Just John Wayne. I mean, just take the John Wayne. There's World War II. What can I tell you you don't know? Then I began researching. I began finding things like Rommel. The character of Erwin Rommel, the German voice, the Desert Fox. Most people don't know that story. Eisenhower and Patton and Bradley and Churchill. Okay, these are names you know, but do you know the story? In finishing that series, first of all, I did a trilogy. Publishers like trilogies. I don't know why. They can put them in a box. They have boxes in here. The first Civil War, Gods and Generals, Killer Angels, Last Full Measure. It's in a box, trilogy. They decided they wanted me to do a trilogy on the war in Europe. So I've been waiting for them to put that in a box. I'm getting letters from Marines about the trilogy. It's set in Europe. The Marines are saying, Europe? What's this Europe crap? We're not in Europe. It's a good idea not to get Marines mad at you. There's that other war halfway around the world. So I did I convinced Random House to let me do a 4-book trilogy. And your math is better than theirs. And so I did a 4th book, The End of the War in the Pacific. Now, again, Korea is right there. Then this thing happens a couple of years ago. The sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And I began to get pressure to kind of go back and take another look at that. And I started thinking about the letters I've received, lots of letters from people in Mississippi and Tennessee who've said to me, we're awfully tired of hearing about Robert E. Lee in Virginia. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on, out there, west of the mountains, that nobody ever writes about. And you know what? They're right. And I started researching and figured, okay, what I want to do, trilogy. Here's this trilogy thing again. Do a trilogy, have each book come out in the 150th anniversary year of the event. 2012, Shiloh, 1862. Shiloh, the story, A Blaze of Glory, is the first of this set. And Shiloh, if you know the history, a lot of Civil War buffs, surprise me, they don't know the history. The history is one thing, but it's the stories of what happens there, and primarily the stories of 2 people that change history First of all, the briefest history lesson at Shiloh, southern Tennessee, middle of nowhere. By the way, today, Shiloh is one of those few battlefields that's not under threat of development. Nobody wants to live there. All due respect to the 12 people who do live there, and I don't think any of them are here. But in fact, I mean, what happens at Shiloh, first of all, you've all heard of First Manassas, Bull Run, the first big battle of the Civil War, summer of 1861. 5,000 casualties. Now that's a horrible number. At Shiloh, a few months later, 24,000 casualties. 5 times as many, and it's not near a media center. There is not a single, and I wish somebody could contradict me on this, there is not a single photograph from the battlefield at Shiloh, not one. And if you know of one, there are a whole bunch of historians looking for it. Let me know. But not one. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's no reporters, no photographers there. Nobody cares. Well, a couple people care. 2 particular individuals at Shiloh change history. One of them you may have heard of, Albert Sidney Johnston. Now, if that name means nothing to you, you're not alone. Albert Sidney Johnston is the Confederate commander at Shiloh. He is one of the, pun intended, dying breed of generals who leads from the front. Not a good idea. On Sunday, April 6th, April 6th, 1862, middle of the afternoon, Johnston is out front leading his troops. It's chaotic, the battle. He's got bullet holes in his coat already. His horse is wounded 4 times and dies from those wounds. And Johnston is in the middle of the chaos, and what's happening around him is victory. He's winning the day. The whole idea is to get on the right wing of the Confederate Army to push up along the Tennessee River, cutting Ulysses Grant's army, the federal forces, away from the river. If Johnston can get his people up and do that, Grant's army is defeated, possibly destroyed, and most definitely would be forced to surrender. An enormous victory for the South. Johnston is succeeding at doing this when he goes down. Roughly 3 in the afternoon on April 6th. Everything stops when he goes down. The reason that's important outside of Shiloh, in the hierarchy of the Confederacy, Albert Sidney Johnston outranks Robert E. Lee. He's also best friends with Jefferson Davis. Now, we all know that Lee is appointed command of the Army of Northern Virginia in the summer of 1862, 3 months after Johnston's death. What I say is, if Johnston had lived, Jefferson Davis, it would have been protocol for one thing. Davis would have called Johnston to come east and take over command of the Army of Northern Virginia, and we never would have heard of Robert E. Lee. And that's not an insult to Lee. Lee was a clerk under Davis's thumb in Richmond. Again, not an insult. He's good at it. He's really good at it. Davis needs him there. Lee hates it. He gets the opportunity to command. He takes that command, the Army of Northern Virginia, and of course the rest, as they say, is history. But had Johnston lived and Johnston taken that command, what would have happened? What would have been different? I love the what ifs. The flip side of that coin is Ulysses Grant. If Grant loses the Battle of Shiloh, that's the end of his career. We never would have heard of Ulysses Grant, the 18th President of the United States. That's how history was changed at Shiloh. It was also changed in 24,000 other ways, which is part of the story. The centerpiece of this trilogy always was to be Vicksburg. Much like my father's book, Gettysburg. Think about Gettysburg. It's not the final battle of the war. It's not like the ultimate climactic event. It's sort of in the middle. There's a lot of stuff goes on afterwards. Well, I realize the same thing is true of Vicksburg. The problem with Vicksburg, the problem why most people, even Civil War buffs, don't know anything about Vicksburg, it takes place at exactly the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg. So we are all here celebrating the 150th of Gettysburg this week. It's also the 150th of Vicksburg. Nobody cares. I was in Vicksburg over Memorial Day weekend. They celebrated their 150th then, because they knew if they tried to do it this week, July 4th, 1863 is when Vicksburg falls to Grant. Grant's army, 30,000 troops, Confederate troops, are surrendered to Ulysses Grant. It's a catastrophic day for the Confederacy. That happens one day after Pickett's charge. Look where Gettysburg is. Right now, we are within, 100 miles of Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, not much farther from Richmond. The media centers. Where do you think all the reporters and the photographers are? They're right here. In Vicksburg, today is still in the middle of nowhere. With all due respect to those 12 people who would get mad at me. But I mean, I feel bad for them, because what happened, and I'll say this, in this place I will make this statement, what happened at Vicksburg is more important than what happened here. Oh, okay, yeah. By opening up the Mississippi River, what Grant accomplishes, well, first of all, two things. History-changing events. By opening up the Mississippi River to federal control, you've just cut off Texas, Arkansas, and most of Louisiana from the Confederacy. So all of the men, the equipment, the food, the supplies that come out of that part of the country don't come out of that part of the country anymore. It ends. The other part of that is the Union now controls from all those states in what was the Northwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, all those states can now ship their goods and their men and their equipment and their food all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And they do it. And that changes very much the tide. It's the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. The story at Vicksburg can't be told without talking about John C. Pemberton. Now, you never heard of John C. Pemberton, that's okay, I'll tell you who he is. He's the Confederate commander at Vicksburg. John C. Pemberton has, among other problems, one of which is his incompetence, one of his problems is he is a Pennsylvanian. He's from Philadelphia. He marries a woman from Virginia and is so enamored of her that when the war breaks out, this man's a West Pointer, this man has been in the Mexican War. When the war breaks out, he pledges his allegiance to his wife and thus to Virginia, and he goes south. Not many West Pointers who are, from the North do that during the war. Pemberton's one of them. The problem with that is, in his own army, a lot of his subordinates, his generals underneath him, all the way down to the privates, don't quite believe that Pemberton is one of them. And then, of course, on July 4th, 1863, when he does surrender his army, there are people in that army who say, and this is the phrase they use, "Old Pem sold us out." Like it's a conspiracy theory. Well, I don't believe that. First of all, there's no evidence that Pemberton was anything more than an honest man who just, had too much love for a woman. It gets a lot of us into trouble. And in fact, he was a loyal Confederate, Philadelphia notwithstanding. He just wasn't as good a general as Ulysses Grant. What Grant accomplishes in Mississippi in the spring of 1863, besides changing history, changes textbooks. At the United States Military Academy in West Point, Ulysses Grant's campaign is considered one of the finest, possibly the finest, overland campaign ever waged by an American commander and possibly by any commander. We think of the term blitzkrieg as being invented by the Germans in World War II, lightning warfare. No, Grant, he doesn't call it that. That's what Grant does in Mississippi in the spring of 1863. By the time he crosses the river into Mississippi from Louisiana, he wages a campaign. He wins battles at Raymond, at Jackson, Mississippi, at Champion Hill, at the Big Black River, and finally gets to Vicksburg. And the Confederates under Pemberton can't keep up with him. It's a magnificent campaign that cements Grant's reputation. And that's a story you need to know, because that's why Grant's on the $50 bill, among other things. Well, it's also why he's 18th President of the United States. In going through the story, I realized, first of all, when I did World War I, when I got to the 20th century, up until that point, all the stories have been told from the top down. The generals, my father's story, told from the top down. When you get to the 20th century, remember that crack I made about generals leading from the front? They learn. Now the generals are, back there. You get to World War I, to tell that story from the top down just doesn't work anymore, because you need that guy out there. You need the kid, with the carbine and with the Enfield, or in World War II with the M1 or the Thompson submachine gun. You need that character to tell the story, and that's what I did. Now, going back to these stories in the West, I like that, and so I'm doing it again. And I've got a young kid named Fritz Bauer, Dutchie Bauer from Wisconsin, who, think about the kids. These guys, when I say kids, I'm talking 19, 20-year-olds. These people going to war, they're all excited. This is good. They're going to go off and win honor and be heroes and all of that, and they're fighting for the flag. And then they've never seen a rebel. They don't know what a rebel is. They go south at Shiloh, Dutchie Bauer, when the Confederates surprise, the entire Union Army, and it's a long story, and I won't go into the history, but Bauer, along with a whole bunch of these guys who feel like, we're unbeatable. What do they do when the Confederates come up over the hill, screaming into their faces with the bayonets? They run. And it's not a good day for a Union soldier on April 6th. Well, now, by the time of Vicksburg, Bauer's a veteran, and he begins to understand what that means. And what it means is it costs you something to be a veteran, because you've seen things that you ought not see. You've experienced things, you've done things that no man should be asked to do, and the ones who stick around are going to do it again, and it's inevitable. And so he knows that. Now he's a completely different character than he was in the Shiloh book. Another huge difference when you talk about Vicksburg. In the Civil War, almost always, the civilians get out of the way. Fredericksburg is a great example. Fredericksburg, Virginia, December of 1862. Robert E. Lee is back on the mountain with his troops. Here's the town of Fredericksburg. There's the Rappahannock River, and across the river is Burnside and the Union Army. The town's right in the way. Lee tells the townspeople, get out. And they do. They load their wagons with whatever they can carry, and they make this refugee train out of the town, and, they're out of the way. At Vicksburg, they stay. And so the civilians in Vicksburg suffer the same privations as their army when the siege begins. The first thing that happens, if you're living in Vicksburg, the Union gunboats on the Mississippi River start to shell the town non-stop. You're in your bedroom and a 200-pound mortar shell suddenly comes through your ceiling. You can't stay in your house. What do? If you've been to Vicksburg, you know the way the ground is. It's very cut. A lot of gullies and ravines, very three-dimensional. They go out in the countryside and they dig caves. Now they try to take home with them dishes, linens, something to make it feel like home, but they're living in holes in the ground. It's not a very good way to live. Then the food runs out. And very quickly, the civilians discover exactly what their soldiers discover, that, mule meat is not bad. There's a problem when you eat the mules. You don't have anything left to pull anything with. And so ambulances no longer can go back to the town where the makeshift hospitals are, so the hospitals have to move to the front. When the mule meat runs out, there's an interesting phenomenon, and some of you may know this, and we just had a siren go by out here. Have you ever heard a dog howl whenever they hear a siren? I mean, it's how I've heard it a lot. There's something about the sound of an ambulance or a fire truck that a dog will respond to it by howling. In Vicksburg, the same thing happens with the Union artillery shells coming in. A lot of them screech and scream and have these weird noises. The dogs respond by howling at the artillery attacks. Gradually, over time, there are fewer and fewer dogs until finally the howling stops. and then they start eating what is euphemistically called squirrel stew. Rats. That's the suffering of the civilians in Vicksburg. I had to have a civilian. And I've got 4 diaries from women who endured the siege, and I made use of that. And there's a woman, 19-year-old girl named Lucy Spence. Now you think about a 19-year-old in the 1860s, very proper, very naive, Victorian era. By the end of this story, Lucy Spence is neither one, neither naive nor proper. She volunteers to be a nurse in one of the hospitals, and she has her hands in some of the most horrific things anyone can be expected to endure. But her story is a crucial part of this story. Sometimes, when I'm on tour and traveling around the country like I was most of May and early June, I forget where I am. Last year, when the Shiloh book comes out, and I'm talking about this like I am now, and someone invariably will ask me, what's next, or how are you going to finish the trilogy? And I began to say, got the question, said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to burn Atlanta with Sherman and go through the March to the Sea, and then, in the Carolinas with Sherman and Joe Johnston. I said this to the audience in Atlanta, Georgia. The response was dead silence. I was at the Atlanta History Center, marvelous place, and like 300 people there. And I realized, you're in Atlanta. Well, so then I'm trying to, okay, let's see. Start to tap down. Oh, well, one of the characters, of course, will be the Confederate commander, John Bell Hood. And I realized John Bell Hood is the general who basically gives Atlanta to William T. Sherman. Okay, that didn't work. Well, then, of course, there'll be Joe Johnston. Then I realized, of course, Joe Johnston is the guy who retreats across Georgia and gives Sherman, the March to the Sea, and I'm just digging it deeper. And, well, this year I went back very contrite and very humble, and they forgave me, and I spoke again at the Atlanta History Center, having paid attention to the fact that I'm in Atlanta, so watch what you say. I realized that if I go from Vicksburg to Atlanta, I've just skipped a huge chunk of history. And so I went back in January to New York, sat down with Random House, and convinced them once again to let me do a 4-book trilogy. And they bought it again. So the 3rd book now, which I'm actually up to my ears right now, is Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain. And again, if you've never really heard of what happened at Chattanooga, that's okay, you're not alone. But what happens there, besides Grant and Sherman, again, you've got a man that I've gotten grief for having ignored, one of the finest Union commanders in the field, George Thomas. And so he will be a character in the story. And on the other side, if you love John C. Pemberton, wait till you meet Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg, the Confederate commander at Chattanooga, is possibly the most despised person in the Confederate Army, and he's in charge. And he wages a greater war with his own subordinates, Longstreet, Leonidas Polk, Hardee, the whole, the good commanders underneath him. That's who Bragg would rather fight with, and that doesn't really work. Well, and then the 4th book will, burn Atlanta and, I'm very excited about this. The only problem is, because of people ask me, do you write from an outline? History is the outline. I have a sesquicentennial, the calendar. Each of these books is coming out in a year apart, which is not something I don't think I would do again. Following this series, I can't tell you how many letters I've gotten from people in Texas saying, you need to write the story of the War for Texas Independence. Now, when I say that to you, the first thing probably comes to mind is the Alamo. The Alamo is the Alamo because of John Wayne and Fess Parker and Billy Bob Thornton. But the Alamo, with all due respect, the Alamo's 3 chapters. I mean, the rest of the story, Sam Houston, I mean, there's some great stuff there. And I proposed this to Random House, and they said, ooh, well, let's check on this. Well, this is what they do. It has nothing to do with what I want to do. They have their marketing people, and they talked to me and said, oh, yeah, people in Texas buy a lot of books. Who knew? And they especially buy books about Texas. So that's what I'm doing. And then now, meanwhile, the Korea people, they're really mad at me. You should see the letters I get from some of these old Marines who are at the Chosin Reservoir, and I get it. I mean, that's a story I want to do, and I will do it eventually. But, I mean, that's sort of, I have a pretty full plate. When people throw ideas at me for stories, they have to understand that at the end of the day, if Random House won't print it, not much point in me writing it. So if you have a great-great-grandfather who fought here and you have his letters and you think this would make a great book, by all means, write it yourself. I mean, I appreciate the input. I can't do all of that. I've been sort of flippant here, and I don't want to do that much more. I want to tell you a story, and I'm just going to ask you to indulge me on this. I want you to imagine you are a young Confederate soldier, barefoot. You've been marching all night long. You're exhausted. You don't know where you are, where you're going, what the officers are doing. That's not your job. Your job is to get in the road with your musket and march when they tell you to march. You get to the woods in the middle of the night. You're in forest. You're looking around. All your buddies, you sit there, you try to get some sleep. The sun comes up. You're wondering if anything's going to happen. Nothing's happening. So people have little campfires, people are playing cards, guys are reading Bibles, guys are writing letters home. They're just sort of killing time, milling around, and you're trying to catch some sleep if you can. And then an artillery attack breaks out. But it's not coming at you, it's going the other way. And you're listening, it's about middle of the day, and you suddenly hear all these cannons, and you realize they're going that way. Well, that's a good thing. And you're listening to that, and there's something lulling about that. A lot of times soldiers will tell you, in the middle of an artillery barrage, they can fall asleep. It's like a lullaby, the ultimate white noise. Well, this goes on for a while, and you sort of get numb to that, and you're leaning against a tree, and suddenly the artillery stops. And you sort of jolted awake, and now drums start to beat. And you know what that means. The call to assembly, a bugle blows, and everybody gets up, almost out of instinct. You've been trained to do this. And you stand up, and here come the officers. You see guys scrambling around. Here's the sergeant. He's yelling profanities, because that's what the sergeant does. And guys start falling into line, and you're shoulder to shoulder with your buddies. You're still in the woods. You don't know what you're doing there. And next thing you hear, once everybody gets organized, and here's the lieutenant standing out in front of you, and he's got his sword out of his scabbard, and he's looking at you, making sure everybody's in line. The sergeant's behind you, cussing at everybody he can. And now there's another bugle call. And you know what that one means. It means advance. And so you begin to step with the guys next to you, and you walk through the woods, and you don't know how far the woods are going to go until suddenly they stop, and you walk out into the open. And boy, is it open. You're looking across a mile of open ground. There's grassy fields. There's a few cornfields out there. And you're stunned by this sight. You look out across that hill, and up it rises toward the end. And out there's a clump of trees and a black line. And you know what that black line is. It's a stone wall. And that's about all you can see. Maybe there's a wagon moving, but you're not paying attention to that, because what you're really noticing is on both sides of you, as far as you can see, are guys just like you, shoulder to shoulder, standing there, walking slowly through the grass, the beating of the drums, the lieutenant in front of you, the sergeant behind you, another row of guys back there. You're walking out through this grass, and then you realize that whoever is over there, they can see you too. And now you see puffs of smoke on that far hill. You can't hear anything yet. All you're hearing is the drums. It takes a while for that sound to get to you, but you know what that is. That's artillery. and you begin to see the solid balls coming through the grass like bowling balls skipping through the grass, and they're coming so fast there's nothing you can do. You can't get out of the way. You can't move. You're shoulder to shoulder, and suddenly right down the line from you, 3 guys disappear, and you keep walking. You're walking out through deep grass. There's more and more of these bowling balls coming at you, and then that begins to change, and now they become exploding shot, and the shots begin to explode right over your head. You hear the whistling of shrapnel as the steel shreds come by you. Things blast in the ground right out in front of you. Things come overhead and blow up behind you. The smoke begins to find you. The smell, that acrid sulfur stink, starts to get into your nose. You begin to choke a little bit. The lieutenant's looking back at you. You better keep walking. The sergeant's behind you. He's still yelling. You get further out into the field. More and more of these shells erupt. More and more smoke finds you. And suddenly you find yourself at a fence. And there's a road on the other side of the fence. And the order comes down, stop, take the fence down. So you're undoing limbers, you're taking the railings of the fence down, so the guys behind you will have an easy time of it. You cross the road, and you're terrified now, because right out in front of you, about 40 guys in blue jump up, fire their muskets at you, and run away. You know what that is. That's the skirmish line. Their job is just to sort of hold you up, but there's not enough of them. And so they vanish back up into the smoke up the hill. You cross the road, you realize now you are walking uphill. It gets harder. You're getting tired, you're sweating like crazy. This musket's getting heavier in your hands. Your heart is beating 150 beats a minute because you are scared out of your mind. You can't see anymore what's happening in front of you, except you catch a glimpse over here on your right of a whole bunch of blue. Guys come down the hill and form a line, and they fire their muskets. That's called enfilade fire. It comes right down your line, and for the first time you hear that horrible sound of a cracking walnut. It's the sound of lead on bone, and the guy next to you goes down. And your first thought is, you know him. You want to stop and help him. The sergeant shoves you in the back. The lieutenant yells at you, and you keep going. And the guy next to him pulls up next to you. You close up the hole in the line like he's never been there. You're climbing the hill, the smoke, you cannot breathe. You get up, and you suddenly realize that rock wall you saw is right in front of you. And you get to it, and the guys in blue behind the wall, suddenly 1,000 hats come up, and you catch a reflection off 1,000 bayonets, and they point down the hill at you, and they fire a volley of their own. And now you hear a lot of those cracking walnuts, and you keep going. You get to the stone wall, and a bunch of those guys in blue get up and run away. That's wonderful. That's what you want to see. You want to shoot. You don't even remember if you fired your musket or not. You don't even remember if it's loaded, but there's no time for that. The lieutenant's there waving his sword. You cross over the stone wall. You see those guys in blue running up the hill, and you're looking for somebody. You see a guy down here turn his musket the other way, and he's using it as a club. And you see fist fights breaking out, and guys are rolling on the ground fighting with each other, and you're looking for somebody, for anybody, something to do. And then over the hill right in front of you, here comes a mass of blue. It's the reserves, the guys sent forward to plug that hole in the line, and there are a whole bunch of them. And you're standing there suddenly feeling very alone, and they fire a volley, and you realize the lieutenant's gone. You don't hear the sergeant anymore. The smoke is choking you. And here come the guys in blue, and they're all around you, and there are not many of you anymore. And somebody, a voice of authority behind you, yells, "Retreat!" and a bugle blows. And you know what that means. You do not turn around and run away. Nobody wants to be shot in the back. You back down the hill. You back over the stone wall. You go back down into the grass. And those guys in blue respect the retreat. They come to the stone wall. They know you're beaten. And they stop. And instead of shooting at you, they begin to chant a single word over and over again. Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg. That's their revenge for what you did to them 7 months earlier. What I've just told you, many of you already figured this out a long time ago, This is... What I've just told you is Pickett's charge. Pickett's charge, that story was told to me by my father when I was 12 years old. We started walking at the Virginia Monument, the Lee statue, and began to walk across the ground, and my father began to tell me what had happened on that ground. He told the story to me with a slight variation. Instead of an anonymous Confederate private, he told it to me from the point of view of a Confederate brigade commander, Lewis Armistead. And Lewis Armistead is walking across that ground, leading his brigade right into the guns of his best friend, Winfield Hancock. I have heard people, a backlash to that, people saying they weren't best friends, that's a myth created by your father. Thank you. I have Myra Hancock's memoir published in 1890, and she talks about it. I have the first-hand account of that. Well, we're walking across this ground. My father is telling me this story, and he's caught up in the moment. We cross the Emmitsburg Road. We walk up the hill. I'm 12. I mean, I'm just hanging on every word. He was a master storyteller. We get to the stone wall. We step over. He's describing to me how Armistead stepped over that wall. And we notice there's a little concrete, sort of nondescript concrete monument up there a few yards ahead, and there's a Confederate flag sticking out of the ground. Well, that's sort of strange. We're on the Union side of the line. He walks up, he looks around. It is the marker of the place where Lewis Armistead fell. My father looks at that, I look at him, and I see tears running down his cheeks. I'm 12. I've never seen my old man cry. For that moment, he was Lewis Armistead. That's the story that changed his life, that started an obsession that took him 7 years to complete in writing The Killer Angels, and it most definitely is the story that changed my life and may very well be the reason that some of you are here today. Thank you very much. Time for a few questions. If anyone has a question, I'll be happy to try to answer it for you.
Hi, wonderful experience, thank you. But if you already said it, forgive me, but what did you do before you started writing?
Before I was ever a writer, I was a dealer in rare coins and precious metals in Tampa, Florida. As I said before, I was the businessman in the family. Well, there's a joke that goes around the publishing business that, every 22-year-old that writes a manuscript, every editor has seen the coming-of-age story written by someone who hasn't come of age. And so I don't think, had I tried to be a writer at 22 years old and do what I do now, I don't think it would work. I mean, I was a good bit older than that. And my father was a writer all his life. And by the way, I take very seriously the fact, and I've said this to a few people today, he deserves to be here right now. He deserves to see this, because what the Killer Angels did, the Killer Angels inspired Ken Burns. I just saw Ken last week. Inspired Ken Burns to do his series, the film Gettysburg. All of that comes from the mind of Michael Shaara. And look what he wrought. I mean, look, obviously not all of it, but what percentage of people are here because of Ken Burns or because of Gettysburg or because of the Killer Angels? A lot. And he deserved to see that. That's something I take very seriously. So, yes.
Did your father know you liked to write?
No. Growing up in the house of what was essentially a failed writer. I mean, my father published 4 novels in his lifetime and 70 short stories, and my mother worked for the state of Florida to pay the bills because my father could never pay the bills from his writing. And so as a kid also, his relationship with publishing was very adversarial. He was always in a fight with somebody. He went through 6 agents. He was always yelling into the phone at an editor or something. As the kid, that was my experience watching my father. I had no interest in going in that direction at all.
I've heard you had something to do with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at VMI. Can you tell us that story?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the 4 artillery pieces that were used in the 1850s by Stonewall Jackson before he was called Stonewall, when he was a professor of artillery and various other things badly at VMI. Those guns, about 12 years ago, Colonel Keith Gibson, who runs the VMI Museum, is a dear friend of mine. If you ever go to have a chance to be in Lexington, Virginia, go there. It is a magical place, that museum. We're walking by the cannons, and there's a piece of hardware laying on the ground. The frames are rotten, and the hardware is literally falling off the cannons, and Keith picks up this piece of steel and says, "This is an insult to General Jackson, whose statue is right there." And I asked him, what do you think it would take? And we worked on it for a while, and I ended up giving, I don't want to say this like I'm being self-aggrandizing here, but I gave him a grant to restore those artillery pieces. And so today there's a plaque on the parade ground with my name on it, which is just, I mean, that's amazing to me. But that's my thank you to General Jackson, is to give him back his guns. And that, again, I don't want to sound weird about this, but to have the opportunity to be able to do something like that, that's one of the most fulfilling things that's happened to me. If I can give back in that kind of a thing. And that's my Battlefields book is the same thing. My nonfiction book is my personal take on the 10 sites you should all visit. All the royalties from that go right back to battlefield preservation. I feel very strongly. I'm not up here because I'm a one-man show. I mean, I'm up here because of you. I take that very seriously.
Thank you. Thank you. First off, your father's book and your subsequent books got me interested in the Civil War, so thank you so much for that, and I appreciate that. Second, one of the things I like most about your books and your father's book was that when you read it from the Union point of view, you totally see where they're coming from and you're rooting for them. When you read it from the Confederate point of view, you totally see where they're coming from, and for a minute you start to root for them too. And even when I started to read Gone for Soldiers, you wrote from Santa Anna's point of view, and I totally saw where he was coming from, even though he was a pretty bad dictator. And you've kept that going in your subsequent book, where you're writing from the point of view of Nazis even, and with Rommel sort of a wishy-washy on that front. But
Albert Speer.
How do you you really do a good job of getting into their heads, and as you start to get into these books down the line where the different points of view aren't really Union and Confederate, they're much, much, much more radical than that. How do you continue to try to really find empathy with these different characters, especially thinking of Santa Anna?
Well, I'll give you that's a good question. I'll give you a perfect example of that. There's a woman over here. And that is my 4th book on World War II deals with Okinawa and the bomb. I have a memoir by the Japanese chief of staff to General Ushijima, who was the Japanese commander on Okinawa. Now, you would think right on, if any of you particularly were in the Pacific during World War II, you don't really look at the Japanese with much sympathy or much empathy, and neither do I, but they're human beings to an extent, and I say that as a big flag. But General Ushijima, that's a good story, and that's why I'm up here in the first place. It's not about the history lesson, it's about finding out what these people were about. And the story of the bomb on Hiroshima, is told from Paul Tibbets's point of view. This is the guy who drops the bomb. There's also a Japanese doctor who runs a clinic right outside of Hiroshima who sees it and experiences it. So you do get both sides. The lesson there came from the film Gettysburg. When people came out, and I saw this a lot, people came out of that film struck by the fact that there were no bad guys. This is not John Wayne and the guys in the black hats. It's a human story where people are fighting for something they deeply believe in. Whether you believe in it, whether you think they're right or wrong or politically correct, I don't care. I'm trying to tell you the story the way they would tell it. And that's really, I've gotten critics, I had a guy ask me this live on the radio, I love this, in Chicago. How can you write a positive portrayal of Robert E. Lee when he was pro-slavery? Well, in fact, that's not quite the way it was, but that's not the point. The point is, right from the point of view of his era, what it was like for him, what his experiences were, and it doesn't matter what side he's on. One of the nicest compliments I've received, people about my first 2 World War II books, people said to me, you know, I didn't want to like Rommel, but I couldn't help it. Bingo. That's the point. You know, he's a 3-dimensional human being, and that's what makes these stories, I hope it's what makes these stories work. She's over there.
I just wondered if there's going to be a sequel, you know, about a movie about Appomattox, you know, to complete your trilogy.
Yeah, the question about The Last Full Measure, and I know a lot of you have asked this question, and I hear it a lot. I know Ron Maxwell hears it a lot. Ted Turner lost a lot of money on Gods and Generals. As a result of that, Ted is off the table. He's no longer in the movie business. Now, he may change his mind, I mean, who knows, but right now there is no plan. Nothing is in the works for Last Full Measure. Never say never. I mean, there's hope. You know, a lot of effort will be ongoing to make that happen. Unfortunately, the window of when that film should have been released is right now. This would have been the perfect time, but there's nothing, despite rumors, and I hear all kinds of rumors, we're filming in secret. Why? Why would we make it a secret? Well, but no, I mean, in all seriousness, I hope it happens. I mean, I have faith it'll happen one day. You never know. Right now, nothing is going on with it. Time for one more.
I realize there's a sergeant and a lieutenant in the line that's marching across the field, but do you have an opinion on what it is that keeps men marching in a straight line at another line, coming to them and each other shooting them in many, many wars, maybe culminating that style of war with the Civil War? What keeps them going?
I had that same question asked to me by cadets at West Point. I didn't want to hear that from cadets at West Point, asking the question if I thought they were up to that. Would they do that? You know, do they have the, I mean, they were asking the questions of themselves. I hear that a lot, and people sort of look at these movies. First of all, there's the Hollywood version of an attack where everybody's just running lickety-split and screaming and yelling. Yeah, try that with a 10-pound musket for a mile and see what kind of shape you're in. No, they walk. They walk one step at a time, and when a guy goes down next to them, they pull up and they keep walking. How does that happen? That's a question. And of course, if it didn't happen, wars wouldn't happen. Who fights wars? Young people. Young people who believe they are invincible. That's been true for thousands of years. And the Civil War is probably that turning point, because always this happens, the weapons get better faster than the tactics can change. And so all these West Point officers who've learned Napoleonic tactics, the textbooks at West Point are in French. They're all from Napoleon. That's how they fought. They stood up and marched in the straight lines because the weapons were lousy. Now, by the 1860s, the weapons aren't lousy anymore, but they're still fighting the same way. That's why people like Longstreet understand that, you know, digging a hole in the ground is not a bad thing. Early in the war, to ask a guy to carry a shovel was shaming him. Nobody would carry a shovel. You stood up like a man and you faced your enemy. By the last year or so of the war, you couldn't get enough shovels. Just look at Vicksburg, look at Petersburg, you know, everybody's digging holes in the ground. But it doesn't change there. You go to World War I, the French in 1914 go marching off across the field on horseback with flags flying and trumpets blowing. The Germans have the machine gun. Horses and machine guns don't go together. And very quickly they learn that. But that's just, you know, it's human nature, and you're asking young people to do what you expect them to do and what they expect of themselves, and they do it. And that's a great mystery to me, and it was an interesting mystery to hear from West Point cadets. I think today we know better, but then again, maybe we don't. And that's not a political statement, but that's all I can say about that. You've been very patient. I'm going to go back inside and sign some books. Thank you very much.